Hi, so in this video, I'm going to talk about the constitutional settlement as a result of the Glorious Revolution. It's just going to be quite brief, just running through the key events here. So think about historical interpretations, the Declaration and Bill of Rights, then some events after 1689, then trying to kind of summarize it all, bring it together, and finally looking at an interpretation question. So to start off with the historical interpretations on this. So really there's the key issue here, or one of the key issues, is what do we mean by the constitutional settlement? Are we talking about 1688 to 89, so the direct events of the Glorious Revolution and immediately after in 88 and 89, or are we taking it up to 1701? Because that really does change how you can view this and really the events that we're talking about and the significance of those events. So the Whig view, the traditional view of the Glorious Revolution and the settlement, was that this was a return to the path of progress. So on the right-hand side, you can see that it's the path. On the left, there is tyranny and absolutism, and on the right is prosperity and democracy, parliamentary democracy and things like that. And so what the Whigs argued in the 19th century and onwards is that this was a return to that path of prosperity. The Stuart monarchs were taking England down this road of tyranny and absolutism. And the events of 88, 89 put England back on this track, which you could say started with Magna Carta, right? And then ended up at the pinnacle, as they would see it, of kind of Victorian prosperity. Right, so it's obviously very much based in the time it was written, Macaulay writing in the mid-19th century. The Marxist view said actually the constitutional settlement wasn't any significant change, and they would say, I've got a picture there of Charles I getting his head cut off. That was much more revolutionary. The establishment of a republic, that's much more important. The constitutional settlement of 88 and 89, Marxists say, is a kind of bourgeois revolution, didn't really change anything, only affecting the political elites. More recent historians from the 80s onwards have argued that actually we need to take a longer term view, a broader scope on this, and think about not just the constitutional settlement of 88 and 89, but also think about the financial issues, religion, and obviously politics. So the revisionists saying we need to take it up to 1701 at least and go back as well to compare. So that's just a quick run through of the historical interpretations on this. So when you're talking about constitutional settlement, think about, well, how are historians defining that? If you get a question on this, how are they going up to 1701? Is it just 88 and 89? What's their definition of constitutional settlement? That's important. Okay, so it's really important that you understand the Declaration and the Bill of Rights here. In 1689, the Declaration was read out to William and Mary when they took the throne, and this clearly sets out monarchical power. Okay, so it puts limits on their power. This is something that Parliament had tried to do in the reign of Charles I, particularly. And you can see this is kind of tying up the knots that were there in terms of the balance of power between the monarch and Parliament. This was passed in law as the Bill of Rights. I've just added something there, so I'll put that back up. This was passed in law as the Bill of Rights, which was actually watered down, which the Bill of Rights, as it says here, sets out obligations of the monarch and limits their power, and arguably it's unprecedented. So there's actually a website which goes through all of the points on the Bill of Rights. It's got it listed, which I'll link to in a second. And you can see all of the different things it does. For example, it says there should be free and regular elections, that type of thing. What it's really important to know is that the Bill of Rights is weaker than the Declaration of Rights, because the Bill of Rights, there needed to be political compromise to get that passed in Parliament. So it's quite vague. There's no mechanisms of enforcement. And historians have said this is because of, William and Parliament needed to just kind of get this done, political expediency. the monarch was still the head of government and could veto, declare war, and had patronage. Okay, so it could appoint key, people to key positions. Here is the big list of the, all of the things that the monarch can and can't do. So, not having cruel and unusual punishments or excessive fines, all of these things are kind of set out really for the first time in one document. However, is it unprecedented? Well, we've had things like the Petition of Right in 1628. Maybe it's not completely unprecedented. It's on paper for the first time, all laid out in that way, which arguably is significant. The other thing to add is the Mutiny Act of 1689, which you would include under the kind of constitutional settlement, which, as it says here, restrained the monarch's control of the military and said that a standing army in peacetime was illegal without parliamentary consent. So again, this has been an issue for Parliament and the earlier Stuart monarchs. And again, this is kind of tying up those loose ends. So you should really be thinking about, to what extent is this revolutionary? To what extent is this really a shift in the balance of power? Or is it something that's done quite quickly for kind of political reasons? It's just, William needed to kind of justify his reign and just needed to kind of get going. If we're going after 89, then we need to think about the war, the impact of the 9 Years' War. And I've done a video on finance where I talk much more about this. But what happens really is that William increasingly relies on Parliament for finance due to the war. So Parliament could use that as leverage against William, and then they therefore push for more power. So I've just put 3 points here: Triennial Act, Civil List Act, and Act of Settlement. And these are significant. I would argue that the balance of power really does shift because of these things. Obviously, there's caveats to that, but if you are looking at the constitutional settlement, 88 and 89, as I said before, is one story. If you're going up to 1701, I think it's a slightly different story. I think the balance of power does shift. So just in summary, here are some kind of summary questions that you could think about. And I've put the answers on there for me to run through, but you could develop these a little bit. So how far did the events of 88 and 89 establish a limited monarchy? So I've said to some extent they did. The Bill of Rights did set out limits to the monarch's power, but it was vague and it lacked mechanisms of enforcement. So as I said before, it said there should be free and regular elections, but it didn't define what free is, it didn't define what regular was, and it didn't really say what would happen if the monarch didn't do those things. What were the limits to the constitutional settlement? Well, as I said before, the monarch is still the head of state, could veto, declare war, and had patronage. Again, you could weigh those up, because even though the monarch could veto, and William did veto in 1693, the Triennial Act was passed in 1694, forced through by Parliament. So again, you could kind of weigh that up. Question 3, how far did the balance of power shift between the monarch and Parliament? If we're going from 88 to 1701, I think you need to bring in this financial reliance on Parliament from William, which gave Parliament more power. And then something like the Act of Settlement is a significant example to show how the balance of power shifts. So again, just look at the dates. I think it's a different answer if you're just talking about 88 and 89 to if you're going all the way to 1701. Here's an interpretations question, where we've got the question is, how convincing do you find the view as a result of the Glorious Revolution, Parliament became preeminent? So preeminent meaning, the most significant, at the top of the government of the country. So Hoppe in extract 1 is saying that Parliament did become preeminent. So the constitution which emerged after 1688 was new, not old. So Parliament becomes permanent. And this, this idea that absolute authority resided in parliamentary legislation. So you could kind of weigh that up. To what extent is that true? Again, think about the definitions. If we're talking about the Glorious Revolution, 88 and 89, it's one thing. If we're going up to 1701, it's maybe different. Moral in extract 2 says that actually the Glorious Revolution changed the king without doing much to change the monarchy. Okay, and this idea that it was more vague. Morrill, I think, here is really talking about 88 and 89, whereas I think Hoppet has got a longer term view, again, which links back to my overall argument here. If you think about the constitutional settlement, think about which date you're talking about. So I hope that was useful. Just quickly run through that. Thanks for listening.